Hazır giyim için de aslında hedef pazarlardan biri Amerika Birleşik Devletleri. Dolayısıyla bu bölümü biraz anlamak için değerli bir konu sizlerle buluşturacağım. Amerikan Hazır Giyim ve Ayakkabı Federasyonu Başkanı bizlerle olacak. Bir video mesajı olacak kendisinin Amerika Birleşik Devletleri'nde. Şimdi Steve Lamar'ı dinleyelim efendim. Buyurun.
Thank you, or should I say, Teşekkürler. It's great to be addressing you again. I believe the first time I did so was in June 2008 at the first Istanbul Apparel Conference. It's with great regret that I'm not able to be with you in person this week, but I look forward to seeing many of you in person at the IAF later this month in Philadelphia, and possibly when I'm in Istanbul next month for the World Footwear Congress. You can see that Istanbul and Turkey never stray far from my heart, and your country and industry remain a vital part of our industry ecosystem. We're pleased to see a strong delegation from Turkey at our March 2023 Annual Executive Summit in Washington, D.C. just a few months ago. And I invite you to join us again when we convene the industry's leaders at our March 2024 Annual Executive Summit next March, as I said, March 6th to 8th, 2024 in Washington, D.C. In our short time today, I'd like to share a few perspectives from our vantage point at the corner of politics and fashion in Washington, D.C., and to talk about how those trends affect the industry in Turkey. First, the U.S. economy remains pretty strong. Inflation and interest rates still cause headwinds and headaches, but there is abundant evidence that the U.S. consumer continues to buy. Maybe not quite as wildly as they did in the past few years, but they're definitely out there, both online and in stores. And although there's lots of conflicting signals out there, we're still seeing healthy measures of consumer confidence that is translated into brick and mortar and online sales. The good news in our industry is that even when you switch from buying goods to buying experiences, you still need to have the right clothes and shoes to enjoy those experiences. Inventory continues to be problematic, and a recent survey showed that 4 in 5 retailers and brands still have inventory left over from last year. But it's not nearly as acute as it was over the past year, and each month it gets better. Although with slower sales, that resolution has slowed down. Sadly, this also means that new production orders have been off in recent months as older inventories are drawn down. But we hope to see that situation right itself soon. Consumers continue to look for good deals. So in a time of inflation, they often delay purchases until they can get something they want at the right price. This is particularly the case when their paycheck needs to be stretched across a lot of things that are also seeing price increases. This also means that the traditional buying seasons, and of course, those are now punctuated by our online selling holidays, extend much, much longer than ever before. Although there are still a lot of things to worry about, inflation, interest rates, inventories, supply chains, fickle and constantly changing consumer demand, dysfunction in Washington, labor strikes and availability, we remain cautiously optimistic and pray for a strong holiday season. Second, U.S. trade policy is at a crossroads. Although the Biden administration has focused on economic and foreign policy issues, by design, this has not translated into a clear and well-defined trade policy, certainly not one that follows traditional contours. The signals come from the administration instead reflect what we would call an inward pivot, trying to figure out where we want to go next. Ambassador Catherine Tai of the United States Trade Representative has often talked about how they are forging a new worker-centric and inclusive trade policy. And what she means by this is the administration is now spending time trying to make sure individuals and communities who they feel have been bypassed by previous trade policies are no longer left out. This is admirable because trade does and should be seen to benefit all. And sadly, the benefits of trade are not always widely shared. Although I would add that consumers always benefit from affordability and choice that always accompany global trade. But the approach, which includes foregoing traditional market opening initiatives, suggests we have lost momentum in forging new opportunities. Ambassador Tai often talks about how they are putting the U.S. back into the USTR. And while that is catchy, many around the world have been asking me if the T, which stands for trade, is now on USTR's cutting room floor. Although our Constitution gives Congress the responsibility for trade policy, the Congress also has allowed itself to be distracted, so it has become a compliant partner in this inaction. Major trade programs have been allowed to lapse for record periods of time, casting doubt about the viability of other trade programs with looming expirations. New free trade agreements have been halted, and the focus is now, seems, solely on enforcement. And while smart enforcement is absolutely vital, a robust trade policy that serves our country and industry needs facilitation and new agreements too. And while there's a policy focus on supply chain resiliency, that is often seen as a proxy for how can we get more things made only in the United States. Our country is actively looking at how to advance green trade, something that is long overdue. But early indicators suggest this may also be a proxy for protectionism. And during a time of record inflation, U.S. tariff policy, which President Biden has specifically noted is a contributor to that inflation, tariff policy, as I mentioned, has been inexplicably outsourced back to the Trump administration, which favored tariffs, of course. The one thing that does seem to unite everybody in Washington is how to construct trade policy so it can target competitive threats from China. But there is very little consensus translating into action on what to do next and how policies aimed at elevating China's competitors should be part of the equation. It's possible we'll see some action later this year or even early next, but it's also just as possible, given the high level of dysfunction that Washington tends to exhibit these days, that meaningful action will be postponed until after the 2024 elections. Third, we're in the midst of a huge sourcing shift, maybe the biggest in a generation. As we've seen for some time now, we are witnessing fundamental changes in where products are made and where the inputs from those products come from. This is affecting many industries, not just fashion, but is clearly a driver in our industry. This shows up most markedly as diversification away from China. For the 8-month period ending August of 2023, compared to the 8-month period ending of August 2026, we are seeing as imports into the US market, apparel from China drop from 42% to 35%, footwear from China drop from 73% to 59%, and travel from China drop from 84% to 53%. Now, those are market shares into the United States, but we're seeing similar trends all around the world. Companies are looking for ways to limit risk and foster stability, proximity to markets and suppliers, avoiding supply chain disruptions, driving sustainability, and so on. But a big question remains, where to go and how to best develop capacity and capability to support that journey and destination. Different companies will have different answers as they try to tell you how their diversification from China is going. But frustratingly, this sourcing shift is coming at the same time that U.S. trade policy has decided to go dark. While signals from Washington certainly reinforce the notion that it is time to diversify away from China, those signals are silent on what to do next. And make no mistake, inaction from Washington favors China, as the figures I cited earlier, although down from 2016, are markedly up from last year. Fourth, our industry is becoming increasingly traceable and transparent. Maybe even beyond sourcing diversification, this trend is possibly the single biggest supply chain driver this period will be remembered for. This has long been a dynamic, but we are now seeing greater demand to ask for more information, efforts to make those requests further back in your supply chain than ever before, transparency and traceability requests on a wide variety of issues. And in fact, you'll need to know and understand your entire supply chain all the way back to the raw material like never before. And this dynamic fuels and informs a lot of needs, including a laser focus on making sure you have the right materials, top-notch labor practices, methods to track and reduce your carbon footprint, better buying practices, smarter auditing practices to reduce audit fatigue, and that you absolutely do not have forced labor or restricted substances anywhere in your supply chains. The biggest question I get is, who's behind all this? And the simple answer is everybody. It's being driven internally and being driven externally. And it's showing up in a lot of areas. More government regulations, better and more rigorous industry programs, accelerated efforts, particularly on forced labor and combating climate change, and better authenticity, particularly with e-commerce and the explosion in counterfeits that have come as a result of the growth of e-commerce. This builds on what I call first mile thinking. While we are still worried about how we get that product over the last mile to the consumer, we are now also focused on what happens before the product from concept to consumer even begins the journey and takes its first step on that first mile. There's lots and lots of work to be done here. And I often say this is a continuous journey where each day we need to be better than the previous one. And of course, it all hinges on stronger buyer-supplier partnerships. Finally, our industry will become more regulated than it is now. Related to my previous point, the number of proposed and enacted laws and requirements intending to regulate aspects of our industry, either with a focus on our industry or a broader focus on all industries, have expanded and exploded. As the industry has become more transparent and traceable, the regulatory demands for us to do this are accelerating. At AAFA, we've embraced this challenge and a concept we dub smart accountability. All stakeholders, NGOs, buyers, suppliers, policymakers, and even consumers need to be smarter and more aligned about how we approach regulatory oversight. Along with several industry partners, we've created a set of good regulatory practices called the Threads Protocol. Now, everybody likes a good acronym, and with Threads, we've created an easy to remember mnemonic that gives us a powerful tool through which we can advocate for and shape regulations that will move the needle and make us all more accountable. It includes these features: transparency developed and enforced, harmonized across jurisdictions and industries, realistic timelines, enforceable, adjustable, designed for success, and science-based. So transparent, harmonized, realistic, enforceable, adjustable, designed, and science-based. That's where Threads comes in. Already, Threads has moved the needle on chemical management and climate reporting requirements to make those regulatory initiatives practical, aligned, and implementable. And our approach on digital labels, and thank you again for joining this campaign, is part of this process too. You can read more about Threads at the AAFA website. I'd like to end with a quick focus on Turkey and some suggestions on how we can evolve our partnership. First, I encourage you to figure out your role in the sourcing shift. In effect, what is your competitive advantage and how does it enable you to attract business that is on the move? And this is a question that needs to be answered by the country of Turkey, by the industry in Turkey, and by each individual company in Turkey. You all need an answer for that. Second, seize on the fact that brands and retailers want smaller numbers of more dependable partners who share the same values that they do. How can you best be part of those networks? Third, double down on traceability and transparency, especially with a huge focus on sustainability. Now, for example, every brand and retailer wants to know that they don't have a nexus with Xinjiang in their supply chains and that their partners, you, can help them with growing traceability and transparency requirements, whether they've been imposed externally or internally, to help meet that challenge. Another example, encourage your country leaders to build policies that embrace clean energy, to aid in climate reporting and carbon mitigation efforts that everybody in the industry is going to need to do. Fourth, don't hold your breath for tariff and trade agreements, certainly not those coming from the United States. We may get back in the game soon, and I hope we do, and we're going to be working towards that, but it'll be unwise to wait around. Fifth, as you strive to be part of the solution, don't let yourself be part of the problem. And as a friend of Turkey, let me offer a little bit of tough love here. While you're working to tell your affirmative story, make sure you don't make any unforced errors that enable somebody else, maybe one of your competitors, to tell your negative story. For example, I note in the area of brand protection, the OECD continues to list Turkey as among the top 5 sources of counterfeits. For an industry that prides itself on trust and authenticity, this is not a good look. So let me end with a challenge on a high note. As mentioned before, it was terrific to welcome so many Turkish partners to our digital labeling campaign. But we've just started the process. To realize the full benefits of digital labeling, We now need every country to embrace that approach in their regulations. We're pushing hard in the US, and I know we are soon going to see work with the digital product passport in Europe. But how awesome would it be if Turkey became the first country to allow full digital labeling and led the way for the rest of the world? I look forward to seeing you at many events, both in the United States and in Istanbul over the next month. And I do hope many of you will join us next March in Washington, D.C. at the AAFA Annual Executive Summit. As I mentioned, it's March 6th to 8th, 2024, and we're going to be discussing many of these issues as we jointly fashion a healthy future. Thank you again for inviting me to join by video. Yakunda Guru Shudus.